for the second half of Oceans Day. We're starting off this half with an incredible session that will focus on deep sea mining, which is something that does not get nearly enough attention as it should. So let's please give a huge round of applause for our three fabulous speakers who I will let introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I want to first just present the two very special people sitting on this panel today. I'm Vassar Seidel, and I'm moderating. I work for a digital media nonprofit called the Oxygen Project, and we run underrepresented environmental campaigns. And our focus and my heart and soul is to get a moratorium for deep seabed mining. So that kind of sets precedence for what we're talking today. So Farah is going to give a presentation first, and then we'll hear from Maureen, and then we'll have a little discussion. And in the meantime, please keep note of any questions you have in your mind, because I will make sure we're running on time and turn it over to the floor for a Q&A.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure what's wrong with the slide, but okay, anyway, so thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As Vassar said, my name is Farah Obaidullah, and I'm a longtime ocean advocate and also the founder of Women for Oceans, a platform that promotes diversity in the ocean space as a way to accelerate ocean solutions, but also a platform that connects and amplifies the work of women in particular. I'm also the global campaigner with the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, or DSCC, a coalition of over 90 organizations from around the world, including Greenpeace, WWF, Seas at Risk, and the Blue Marine Foundation. And our mission is to safeguard the health of the deep sea. So we've heard a lot about the ocean today, and hopefully over the past few days you've been hearing about the ocean. We know that it covers over 70% of our planet. We know that the ocean gives us life, and that much of the oxygen that we breathe and that is in our atmosphere today is derived from the ocean. The ocean provides us with food, with jobs, and with well-being. And importantly, the ocean regulates our climate. Yet we also know that the ocean is in serious decline, the health of the ocean. That climate change, overfishing, and pollution are all wreaking havoc to life in the oceans and its ability to carry out the functions that sustain life on Earth as we know it. Just some facts. Did you know that most of the world's fish stocks are either fully or overexploited, or that 1 in 5 fish is caught illegally, or that a staggering 8 to 10 million tons of plastic ends up in our ocean each year? And the oceans are warming, they're acidifying, and they're losing their oxygen content. And all of this is causing havoc to life in the ocean. And this is, of course, as a result of climate change. And as we grapple with these challenges, as ocean lovers, as environmentalists, as concerned citizens, doing everything that we can, everything that is in our power to help mitigate these problems, for example, by ditching single-use plastics, or abstaining from seafood, or by reducing our carbon footprint, a new threat looms for the ocean, and that is deep sea mining. If allowed to go ahead, which, if we don't stop it, can happen in as little as 2 years' time, deep sea mining will cause irreversible damage to life in the deep ocean and risks disturbing the world's largest carbon sink. So let's explore the deep sea. The deep sea is defined as the ocean below 200 meters, and it can extend for kilometers down, the deepest point being the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean at some 11,000 meters below the surface. The deep sea makes up about 90% of the volume of the ocean and 95% of Earth's livable space. Most of the deep ocean is what is known in the high seas, or what are known as the high seas. And these are areas of the ocean that are beyond the jurisdiction of any one nation. And the high seas make up over 2/3 of the ocean, which essentially translates to almost half of our planet. And given this vast size, it is no surprise then that the deep sea boasts a wide range of topographical features, including mountains or seamounts, far taller than the tallest peaks on land, gullies and underwater features such as hydrothermal vents, and of course, a wealth of undiscovered life. The deep sea has largely remained undiscovered because technology is only just advancing to allow us to access and explore it. In fact, 99% of the deep ocean is yet to be discovered, but there may be as many as several million species living down there. What we do know about the deep ocean is that it is rich in biodiversity and that life in the deep sea is vulnerable. And that's because under such enormous pressure, with no light, life is very slow growing and very slow to reproduce. Fish such as orange roughy can reach over 200 years old and only reach sexual maturity at 30. You may have heard of the Greenland shark, a deep sea shark that can reach over 400 years old. And corals, deep sea corals can reach several thousands of years old. And speaking of corals, over half of the world's corals are actually found in the deep sea. So with life growing so slowly in the deep ocean, you can only imagine that it responds poorly to disturbance. In fact, we know that when we cause damage to the deep sea, to deep sea habitat through, for example, bottom trawling, it will take decades, if not hundreds of years, for life to return. And we also know through studies published just this year that disturbing the seabed through bottom trawling releases vast quantities of carbon back into the water column and eventually back into the atmosphere. And some parts of the deep ocean are also rich in minerals. And it is these minerals that a handful of speculative miners want to exploit. And these deposits essentially come in three forms that are interesting to miners. The polymetallic nodules found along the abyssal plains of the deep ocean. They are about the size of a lump of coal and sit on the seabed. They are rich in nickel, cobalt, and in manganese. And these nodules have taken millions of years to form, and they provide essential habitat to animals such as the Casper octopus, which lays her eggs on these nodules. The second type are the polymetallic sulfides from hydrothermal vents. And deep sea hydrothermal vents support some of the most unique and ecologically important communities known to science. In fact, relevant for us right now is that an enzyme isolated from a microbe found in deep sea hydrothermal vents is actually used in the COVID-19 test. The third type of deposits are the cobalt crusts found on seamounts. But it is the polymetallic nodules along the seabed that are of interest in the short term to miners, and specifically those in an area known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, or CCZ, in the Pacific Ocean. Deep sea mining for nodules involves strip mining the seafloor, essentially sucking up these nodules and leaving a wake of destruction in its path. Aside from the direct and immediate destruction of deep sea habitat, deep sea mining will cause plumes of sediment that could spread for many miles beyond the actual mining areas. And you have to imagine sort of the mining happens in the deep sea on the seabed, but because it has to be carried up through several kilometers of water column, the plumes I'm talking about are going to be throughout the water column and then spreading laterally across many miles beyond the mining areas. And then, of course, as this sediment settles down on the seafloor again, it has the potential to suffocate life both in the water column and on the ocean floor. But then there's also wastewater and noise pollution from deep sea mining, which will further impact life in the ocean. And what I mean by wastewater is that once the nodules reach the surface and are collected onto the ships, they are cleaned of sediment, which will then be released back into the ocean, causing, again, secondary plumes of sediment. And so by what is essentially dredging the seabed for nodules, collecting as much as 30 centimeters of seabed beneath the nodules, of sediment in the seabed beneath the nodules, there's a very real risk that the carbon that is locked away in the seabed gets released back into the water column. And we don't yet understand what the consequences of that will be. And even if you imagine that it will take a very long time for the carbon to reach the surface, it may in the meantime interfere with the ocean's biological pump and the ocean's carbon cycle. For example, it may exacerbate ocean acidification. So it would make sense, therefore, that before we decide to pursue such a high-risk and irreversibly destructive new industry, that we at least understand fully what we are getting ourselves into. And this is exactly what scientists are saying. In fact, some 600 marine scientists and some marine policy experts are calling for a pause to deep-sea mining. So as the world rightfully pours their attention onto the global pandemic and the climate crisis, there's this new industry developing without any proper scrutiny that is poised to worsen the biodiversity crisis and risks worsening the climate crisis. So who is in charge of allowing or not allowing deep-sea mining in the high seas, our global commons, to go ahead? Well, there's this international organization called the International Seabed Authority, or ISA, established under the International Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this body is tasked with regulating any future mining activities, and in doing so, it must ensure effective protection of the deep sea, recognizing that the deep sea is designated as the common heritage of all of humankind. The ISA has so far granted 31 deep-sea mining exploration contracts, amounting to an area of 1.3 million square kilometers licensed to date. And there's this little rule in the law of the sea that, if triggered, says that mining can happen in as little as 2 years. Whether there are regulations in place or not, if the 2-year rule is triggered, the party triggering the rule can mine when the 2 years are up. And guess what? This rule was triggered in late June of this year, giving the mining industry an unfair advantage because as it stands, there are no regulations adopted yet, and amidst a global pandemic, governments are struggling to meet. The rule has been triggered by a single nation, Nauru. Nauru also happens to be the sponsoring state of one of the most aggressive companies pushing to mine the deep sea at all cost. And as with everything, once one country starts to mine, then the floodgates open for all the other countries to mine. Remember, I just mentioned that there are already 31 exploration licenses issued. So the bad news is that we have just over 1.5 years to stop deep sea mining from happening. But the good news is we have just over 1.5 years to stop deep sea mining from happening. And momentum is rapidly building to put a stop to this emerging industry. As my colleague Maureen will tell you, those on the front line where the industry wants to begin mining, Pacific Island communities, reject deep sea mining. Hundreds of NGOs and civil society groups are saying no to deep sea mining. The fishing industry, like EU fisheries advisory bodies and the International Pole and Line Foundation, are saying no to deep sea mining. The ocean community, from divers to surfers, are saying no to deep sea mining. Government agencies are also saying no to deep sea mining. In fact, at this year's IUCN World Conservation Congress, a resolution was passed with overwhelming support, including from many government agencies, calling for a moratorium on deep sea mining. And at the state level, the state of Washington, for example, has banned seabed mining from happening in their territorial waters. So has the Northern Territory of Australia. And the Supreme Court of New Zealand has recently rejected seabed mining from happening in their territorial waters. And then there's the European Parliament, which also this year voted in favor of a moratorium on deep sea mining. And as I said, hundreds of scientists are calling for a pause to developing this industry. But even companies and the finance sector are saying no to deep sea mining. Companies like BMW, Volvo, Samsung, Google, Philips are rejecting the idea that we need minerals from the deep sea for our supply chains. They have the foresight to realize that trashing the seabed is not the way out of the climate crisis. Banks are also increasingly excluding deep sea mining from their investment policies. In short, there is no social license to start mining our common heritage. And it's not that hard to imagine why. It is a reckless industry that has no place in the future we are trying to build for our collective world. One that is based on a circular, not linear economy, where take, break, waste is no longer the business model. And it is an industry that is easy to reject. It isn't happening yet. No jobs are at stake, but we know that once it starts, it will be very difficult to stop or even regulate. How are we even going to audit this industry? Who has the jurisdiction or money to go several kilometers deep into the ocean to see if miners are actually following the rules? And how will we regenerate these areas? We can't make the same mistakes as we have in our past. Look how long it's taking us to wean off of fossil fuels. And that's because for so long, governments and companies have argued that there's too much at stake, too many jobs, too much investment in infrastructure from extraction to distribution. I get it, it's a gigantic ship to turn, but with everything we know about how destructive deep sea mining is, why even begin? And here's the thing, we don't need to. Those that want to mine the deep sea, they argue that we need the minerals found in the deep sea, like cobalt, manganese, and nickel, to power electric vehicles and our tech gadgets. But this argument is flawed. For one, there are enough minerals on land to meet the demand for metals. Even the industry says so. Although, yes, we absolutely must improve the way we mine on land. But also, why aren't we recovering metals from our waste streams? Why are we dumping and incinerating waste that contains these precious metals? Why isn't urban mining a thing? Innovations such as bioleaching are already making promising breakthroughs in recovering metals from waste. And why aren't we investing in that? But probably the biggest argument for not needing these metals from the deep sea is because battery technology is evolving at a fast pace. Big companies like Tesla, like BYD, which is the world's second largest producer of electric vehicles, and Volkswagen are all demonstrating success with batteries that do not require these metals. The companies that I mentioned, BMW, Volvo, Google, Samsung, are thinking ahead and know that they won't be needing these metals from the deep sea. And I can tell you that there are more companies and banks ready to join the call for a moratorium on deep sea mining, and you will be hearing about them soon. So as I speak, governments down the road are struggling to break their ties with the industry that is already destroying our lives and our future. We can make sure that history does not repeat itself. So while I've been talking, you've probably seen a QR code on one of the slides behind me, and hopefully that'll be showing throughout the rest of this session. But please do scan it and join the campaign calling on companies to pre-divest from deep sea mining. We don't need it. It is not worth the risk. And this is really an opportunity for us to stop something terrible from happening before it starts. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. So now, Maureen, will you give your presentation, and then we'll turn it over to our conversation and then a Q&A.
Thank you, and Nisam Bulavinaka, Noaya e Maori. My name is Maureen Penciwelli, and I'm with the Pacific Network on Globalization. But I also belong to a collective called the Pacific Blue Line. Lines are very interesting, right? And we are drawing lines consistently. But I want to just contextualize the resistance from the Pacific in a couple of ways. And the first around global narratives and imperatives and how they relate and the entanglement of our positions. The Pacific, which is where I come from, it's the largest ocean. It covers, of the 70%, it is 3/4. We cover 3/4 of the ocean. Our people have settled, ancestors have settled this place, And we are in the big blue blob that, you know, sometimes when I watch the news, particularly the weather, I'm constantly interested whether you will find us between the continental weather systems, because we belong in that big blue ocean. We are very remote in a way, but there is this narrative that describes our region as an underexplored and underexploited region, right? So keep that in mind. The second thing is that the way humans look at ocean is quite interesting. And the doctrines of discovery have been very particular in the context of the Pacific, because it saw this empty space, right? And it was through this idea of empty space and vastness is what we've been talking about, is that as humans, we assume that it is endless in its ability to consider the human endeavors, right? Overfishing. We can keep exploiting because of its vastness. We can't grasp the vastness of that. But for the Pacific Ocean, a way to look at these 160 million square kilometers is that if you took all the lands of the ocean and you put it into the Pacific Ocean, there would still be more Pacific Ocean. So for too long, we've, I want to introduce this idea, this concept of a proving ground as a response. So the Pacific Ocean, because it's seen as this vast empty space, it's enabled all kinds of things to take place. And first, technological things. So the narrative around world peace and the testing of nuclear weapons. The Pacific Ocean became the proving ground for technology in the name of world peace. Over 300 nuclear and thermonuclear weapons were tested in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which is in the north, close to Hawaii, if we're looking for referencing points in that big blue void, down to French-occupied Tahiti, which most of you would know. Before that, Middle Pacific is Kiribati, and then across to Australia. These became the proving grounds for the most powerful destructive weapons in the world, because they always saw the ocean as a space that could absorb the power of the nuclear weapons. So we come from a history, and what I want to say today is that when we look at deep sea mining, we see it from a position that responds to this idea of endless frontiers for exploitation. One, the imperative narrative of today is that these minerals that sits within our EEZs, but also in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, it's still in our ocean. It's still in our home. But we see it as a proving ground again for technologies that haven't been approved at all. If people think that it's simple to mine at the depths that we're talking about, which is up to 400 meters, 600 meters, it is quite difficult. The closest industry player is, of course, oil and gas, right? This is a new frontier to test technology. So the Pacific, we've been in this we've been in this position where 10 years ago, around 2012, the European Commission released a small grant, about less than 3 million euros, to help our countries draft legislations to govern deep sea mining. It triggered this rush because we're an underexploited, but for the longest time, so over 20, 30 years, we've been exploring the seafloor and mapping where the minerals are at. But what the law and these legal instruments were doing was simply signal to the rest of the world that we are ready for exploitation. So the Pacific Ocean, and within our jurisdictions, or within our sovereign jurisdictions, our countries started to issue exploration licenses. And Papua New Guinea issued the first commercial license to a company called Nautilus Inc., which is a Canadian company. Interestingly enough, Nautilus, the directors and the players in Nautilus are the same players that are in one of these really aggressive players today. We have experience with these kinds of mining companies. How did you describe them? Speculative mining companies. We are really experienced in being proving grounds for technology that won't be tried. A couple of years ago, I was in the European Commission listening. They will not live test those technologies. But it's okay to live test it in my backyard because we are so far away. So our resistance comes from a place that these exploration licenses are less than 30 kilometers away from communities. When we talk about the deep, people think it's so far, it's so, how do you relate? But in our context, it's not far. And so we have experiences with the experiments using prototypes only in some of these ecosystems that were talked about, which is hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are amazing places, but in Papua New Guinea, these are really quite phenomenal. So most of our resistance comes from communities which are 30 kilometers away from these exploration sites. They record, using prototypes only, seeing the cloudiness of the ocean, so these sediment plumes. They see creatures that they haven't seen, which is from the deep, wash up to shore. They're seeing fishing grounds become quite difficult because of the noise of these ships and the lights. So we were recording impact even at exploration stages. So our communities, because the ocean have been quite critical, it's our livelihood, it's our cultural attachments to the ocean is quite unique in the Pacific. So, shark calling is very big in PNG, and the communities closest to the mining sites were saying they can't perform these cultural shark calling ceremonies because DSM is interfering. So what I think I bring today is this experience that we have, and we call for a moratorium quite early in the campaign. But increasingly, and as the science catches up, so you've heard how important the scientific finding is now. The deep ocean is probably less understood than our understanding of Mars and the moon. And so now when you look at the science, it's really catching up that this is a really bad proposition, right? We really shouldn't be destroying systems that have taken billions of years to form just so we can get minerals for car batteries. And we can, dress them up as blue and green minerals. So I think I just want to end with one last point, which escapes me now because my time is up. Around narratives. It's okay. Let's go to Q&A.
If you think about it, you can interrupt us and we can jump right in. Thank you. Thank you both. So I'm sitting here and I want to be real with all y'all. I'm from the South. Hi, Mark. And honestly, I'm a little pissed because right now we're sitting on the fringes of COP, and deep sea mining is not on the official program. Yet they're trying to have, and every delegate in that room knows about deep seabed mining because they have delegates who are part of the International Seabed Authority. And they're trying to meet this December to rush and pass the mining code. So the fact it's not even being talked about in COP, it's being hidden from the public. And something that moves me is having someone Maureen, and having Pacific Islanders who have been fighting this fight for decades. I didn't know that much about deep sea mining. 2 years ago at COP, I was told, when I started asking questions about deep sea mining, I was told, do you know what you're up against? And it's already a done deal. So being 24 at the time and understanding the importance of the deep sea and the relation it has to climate and the health of our entire planet, I decided that, that wasn't an option for it to be a done deal. And although I've only been working on this for 2 years, when there's people around the world who it's been affecting their daily lives and their culture and their heritage, it is something that I am very passionate about. So I just wanted to take it to a very real level for a second. But something that Farah mentioned was the climate impacts. And there was a recent report about bottom trawling releasing as much carbon as air travel, as the entire air travel industry. So when you think about bottom trawling and you think about deep sea mining, think about how much carbon will be released from deep sea mining if it is set on an industrial global scale. So let's go into the impacts real quick, because what Maureen mentioned was, and I wrote it down here, is that the impacts are quote unquote so far for so many of us who don't live on the ocean or in Pacific Island communities. But really, deep sea mining impacts will be felt by all of us because it's inextricably linked with climate change and other systems. So could we, either of you guys, take this question and just talk about maybe some of the impacts that go beyond deep sea biodiversity and that we all around the world will feel?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Vassar. I mean, one of the things that, I very briefly touched upon was, for example, fisheries. That the international, or that the EU fisheries bodies and other regional fisheries organizations around the world are also rejecting deep sea mining. And that's because as we're trying to understand what the consequences of deep sea mining could be, some scientists are already trying to model what these sediment plumes that I was talking about could do to fish stocks, for example. And one study, and of course it depends where you're mining and which fish stocks you're studying, but there was one tuna stock that was modeled in the Pacific, and if deep sea mining were to go ahead in this particular area, then you could see catch losses of 15%. That's a lot on a multi-billion-dollar industry. So there's a lot of, there's an economic trade-off beyond sort of the environmental trade-off, obviously, of destroying deep sea habitat, which has far-reaching consequences for everyone, because obviously it's not just about the fish that goes into seafood supply chains. but it's what those fish means to the habitats, to the communities, as Maureen was talking about, that depend on a healthy ocean, right? So that's one of the impacts. And I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the ISA, or the International Seabed Authority. I mean, yes, we've been, talking about deep sea mining, or at least some of us have, like Maureen, for a long time now. But the International Seabed Authority came about at a time, so the text, that was drafted for, that forms the basis of the ISA, came about at a time where we were not concerned with the climate crisis, and we were not concerned with the biodiversity crisis. Now we have governments around the world frantically making commitments to halt both those crises, right? And the ISA does not address either of them in their text. So you have to ask yourself, is it really fit for purpose? Can we really allow an archaic system to decide the fate of our deep ocean when so much is at stake, not just all the way down in the Pacific, but everything is connected, and we are learning that by the day, even more strongly than ever before, that it is all connected, and the impacts are going to be felt by all of us, whether it is in the exacerbating climate effects that releasing the CO2 or this carbon back into the water column will have, and not just in the atmosphere, but as I was saying, in the water column. More carbon in the water column means that the ocean might be less able to absorb the CO2 from the atmosphere, which we need it to do. At the moment, the ocean absorbs about 25 to 30% of all the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. But if you diminish the ocean's ability to do that by, for example, increasing the carbon content through deep seabed mining, then you're just making an already big problem worse. That's just some of the aspects, some of the impacts.
So, we engage contractors a lot because we have these dual sets of responsibilities. So even though our communities are at the forefront of trying to protect the deep ocean by stopping deep sea mining, it's clear that our governments are quite interested. So we are sponsoring states. Nauru, Tonga, Cook Islands, Kiribati are 4 leaders, if you like, in this rush to exploit the deep ocean. But when you come across these kinds of mining companies, they accept that they will destroy. They accept that it will be a destructive practice. What's being negotiated now is what level of harm is going to be acceptable. That's what we're talking about with contractors. What level of harm is going to be acceptable? In our context, under no circumstance is it going to be acceptable now. So the robust rules that we're talking about is coming to interpret what is it that we as humans are willing to accept as a level of harm. Because if you're looking at it, and I think it's not just the impacts that we feel in terms of people, it's precisely that. You have to understand the impact, fish, all of these other species. That's where the level of impact needs to be understood and appreciated. But we are talking about what level of harm is going to be acceptable.
So for most people, this issue, when I'm talking to them about it, is very new, if not a surprise. But for you, Maureen, you have a lot of lived experience. What is your message to the world in this short amount of time that we have before the potential new launch of a global new deep seabed mining industry?
I think we have to come from a position of hope, right? Because I think we've got 1.5 years to go. It's not over until it's over. I come from a long history of peoples that we simply don't subscribe that this is going to go ahead. And it's the only way that we were able to stop nuclear testing. in the Pacific. If we subscribe that this is an imperative that's going to become a reality, then I think we lose. So I think really want to position that 1.5 years gives us enough time to get our act together and rally around to stop this, because it's really nonsensical for us to go down this path to mine our ocean floor for minerals to save the climate. It makes real nonsense that the climate will be saved by mining for these blue-green minerals on the bottom of the ocean. Makes no sense at all. We really should need this time to, as you say, this amplification of people coming in to say this is a bad, bad proposition. It's growing. So I would say join the movement. Stand with us and draw that blue line, because history will speak for itself, but we should not buy in or subscribe that this is an imperative that becomes our reality. It doesn't have to be.
So just bouncing off of that, pro-mining interests oftentimes tout that it's either land-based mining or terrestrial mining, but actually, in reality, it's just an extension of already harmful land-based mining practices. So, Farah, you mentioned alternatives earlier. Can you talk a little bit about how deep-sea mining is simply another destructive extractive industry and what we need for truly regenerative, sustainable solutions?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you said. It isn't one, or the other. The mining industry is saying, well, we need to move away from land-based mining because it's so destructive. It destroys rainforests, there's child labor involved. That is true, absolutely. But deep-sea mining is not set to replace land-based mining. It's going to come in addition to land-based mining. And land-based mining needs to improve. There's no question about that. But there's a very big difference between land-based and terrestrial mining, and that is that with land-based mining, I used to be an auditor in a previous life, and when I think about deep-sea mining, like I said in my talk, we aren't going to be able to audit the deep sea, right? Our mining activities in the deep sea. On land, we can become better. We can say, okay, we will regenerate these areas. We will make sure we don't mine new areas. We will freeze our footprint for land-based mining. We will stop child labor. There's all these things we can do. And again, I am not defending land-based mining, but deep-sea mining is not going to be the solution to the problems we see on land. Deep-sea mining is just going to add to the mining footprint around the world. And it will be worse because we cannot regenerate areas that take millions of years to form. It will be irreversible on human timescales. I think that's a really important thing to note. And then the other thing about alternatives, as I also mentioned, there are alternatives available. And we've seen with the pandemic, for example, how if we're in a crisis, that fuels innovation. And so we've seen that with the way we've all, started, our whole lives are online now, for better or for worse, but we can innovate our way out of this crisis with real innovation. We can say, okay, let's scale up urban mining, let's invest in bioleaching technology, which already exists, by the way. So it's not, this is not something that is difficult to imagine. We just have to prioritize, or look what we're going to prioritize, and it isn't, again, this extractive industry that belongs in the past. We're in a crisis moment. We have tens of thousands of people around in Glasgow alone, but we've got millions of people around the world demanding change. And how is it that we have all these sustainable development goals, and then we're even discussing the possibility of trashing the deep ocean? So, on alternatives, I could talk a lot. I'm not a chemist or a chemical engineer, but I do see, and as I mentioned, there are companies that have the foresight, not because they necessarily care about the world or the environment, these big companies I was mentioning about, but because they know that if we are going to take 1.7 billion cars off of our roads, which is the number of cars that are on our roads today, fossil fuel cars, then we need to come up with a better technology that doesn't rely on precious metals, the definition precious being expensive, right? And even if you're sourcing them from the deep ocean, that's an expensive endeavor. So what these companies are saying is, oh, we need to find a cheap way to replace all these fossil fuel cars. And so they're innovating. They've already innovated batteries that don't require these metals, and that's what they are investing in. So not because they're so necessarily green, although I'm sure that that's also on their agenda, but they look at their bottom line, and their bottom line says we don't need those minerals from the deep ocean. So that's the thing that does also give me hope, that if governments don't listen to activists, if governments don't listen to environmentalists, they will listen to companies. They always do. And we are getting companies to join us in rejecting deep sea mining. And that's why I really hope that you will also scan that QR code and raise your hand up on that website and call on more companies to join this movement. Because then, we really have an argument or leverage, let's say, to tell governments, don't go there.
So that's a great call to action, which I'm going to get to soon, but you guys can go ahead and take out your phones and scan that QR code. But let's talk, I mentioned the December proposal. Can we briefly talk about why that poses even more urgency and maybe, or not maybe, definitely also strengthens our calls for either a moratorium or a ban in the realm of the ISA being fit for purpose?
You can start if you want.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe it's, so as Vassar said, there's this meeting that's likely going to happen in a month from now, where governments are going to meet to discuss, among others, the regulations that need to be adopted or that they want to try to rush through, so that when these 2 years are up that I was talking about, the miners have some kind of regulations in place, although they probably would prefer it if there aren't any. But that is a very, it's only 4 or 5 weeks away. So it is a very important milestone, because many governments will not be able to attend. Like, look at this COP. It's if you're not vaccinated or if you've got travel restrictions or whatever, we're going to see a very skewed participation at that meeting in December, where probably the governments and companies with a vested interest in fast-tracking deep-sea mining will be able to participate, and that is unacceptable. So yeah, we have a moment now to really sort of ramp up that public pressure to let them know that this is not out of sight, out of mind. We are not, entirely oblivious to this industry that's trying to basically make an entry into the world. So yeah, I think we've got these 4 or 5 weeks to increase the pressure, so that they think twice about fast tracking this industry. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that.
I mean, for Pacific Islanders, we're in kind of double-edged here, in a sense, because it was one of our countries that pulled that trigger. Using the narrative that, you're a small developing island state in need of these minerals to grow and develop and reach standards that are higher than they currently face. So, and on the other hand, we are also the frontliners for impacts of climate change. So it doesn't, we're highly aware of the regressive role that some of our countries, sponsoring states, are playing in the ISA to be the frontliners to mine the deep ocean. And yet we're also the frontliners of climate impacts. So this is a very complex conversation that we're having to have with our countries to say, on the one hand, at the global level, you can't be climate champions. And then on the other hand, be the very people who enables and brings us closer to the kinds of climate disasters that we talk about. So those rules, those robust rules are necessary. The global community has taken 7 years to negotiate. The complexities of deep sea mining is phenomenal. geology, biology, ecology, understanding of the oceans, law. It's highly, highly complex, and technology, which is why it's taken so long, but it's necessary. But for us, it's the additional burden of what do we do for countries who can only see one pathway out, which is minerals. And they're sold and persuaded that minerals is the salvation to economic growth and development. So we have this additional burden. Our communities have really had to work extra hard to demonstrate why this remains a bad proposition and why we're calling for an outright ban.
Okay, so I know what you guys are thinking now. What can I do to stop deep seabed mining? So we're going to answer that question for you right now. Farah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, as I said, that's the most immediate thing. Join the likes of Google, Samsung, Volvo, BMW, Philips. There will be more companies that we will be very happy to announce soon. Big names that are also calling for the same thing. So you can do that straight away. If you want to get more involved, think about organizing in your community, writing to your government. The UK, they are one of the governments that that should take a stronger stand. They actually have got they are a sponsoring state of one of the deep sea mining companies. They are kind of sitting on the fence a little bit too much. So on the one hand, they're calling for precaution, and I think it's the UK House of Auditors or something like that that has in, I think, 2019 called for a moratorium, but now they're kind of, they're just trying to keep a low profile so that they don't have to take a firm stance on this. But I think with pressure from people of the, citizens of the UK, hopefully we can see that move, and because what we need to, so there's quite a few countries that are very concerned about deep sea mining. But as with everything political or everything in politics, it takes one country to show leadership. And once one country stands up and says no to deep sea mining as a sort of position, a political national position, then we will see many other countries following suit. Because we've been negotiating or lobbying and talking to different governments around the world, and there are quite a few of them that are ready to take that position as long as someone else does it first. So, let's try and make the UK the first one to say no to deep sea mining on the international stage, and we will see many other countries follow suit. And once we have that domino effect, we will, then I will feel hopeful about stopping this industry in its tracks.
We have a couple of governments that are in the Pacific that have been calling for a pause, a stop to deep sea mining. So Fiji has been quite publicly announcing this call for a moratorium, supported by Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. So I think there is political interest in supporting such a position. But I think we need to look at actions in proportion, because for a long time, we've been carrying the disproportionate burden of proof on why this is so wrong. And I want to talk about our responsibilities in global commons. These minerals are really meant to keep the gadgets running, the cars with the batteries going. So these companies use your agency and also your stories about the need for these things. So I think the developed countries and citizens need to think about consumption in relation to where these minerals will come from. We can only do so much. They sit in our backyard. Certainly we can try and stop them, but there is a bigger question about what additional responsibilities highly industrialized countries and citizens need to think about. So, we say, understand these real links that these minerals will come from somebody else's land, soil, and territories. and it may power and maintain your economic systems, but it will destroy somewhere else. So when we think about actions in proportionality to where we're coming from and what is it that we're doing, because the burden of proof, unfortunately, hasn't fallen on industry players. In fact, they've come in saying, very little impact, lots of money, and they've shifted burden of proof. So I think when we think about global responses, we need to think about in proportionality to communities who are in the front line, already having to demonstrate why this is such a bad idea. So join the campaign, look us up, the blue line, and just start drawing that line. I think it's quite necessary.
So as I do my little bit, you guys can pull out your phones and not look at me and type in the blue line and sign that petition. And I'll just add on to, as I said earlier, I work for the Oxygen Project over here. Mark, wave your hand. He's on YPAC for the Sustainable Ocean Alliance, and together we have a campaign for a moratorium on deep seabed mining. You can sign our petition as well. It's open letter to the UN, ISA, and world representatives. But more importantly, and there will be an announcement, a press release tomorrow morning that you can tune into to really get the full scope, and I don't know if I can really give it away here. But if you go follow the Sustainable Ocean Alliance, you follow the Oxygen Project on, I don't even know if I can say the date, but in the next couple of weeks, there will be an action you can take to use your voice, to take a stand, to put pressure on the International Seabed Authority and the UN to do the right thing, especially in light of this meeting in December. So please use your voice and your platform, and also tune into what that is tomorrow, because I can't really give that any more away. But we are running out of time, and I do want to turn it over to any questions from the audience. Okay, this is going to be hard. Who had their hand up first? You. I think your hand up was first, so that's how I'm choosing. Sorry, guys.
Hello. Okay. Hi. My name is Manuel Salazar. I'm part of the Sea Shepherds. We're a global organization, as you probably know. Paul Watson, which is the founder, says that when the oceans die, we die, and it's true. So we are really bringing a strong stand on this. And as a climate activist, we don't believe in these companies. So then many of the actions we have is direct actions. So basically, you go and drop huge rocks on the bottom of the ocean, so boat trolling cannot happen. Things like that, you know? So that's the stand on that. So basically my question to you is if there's any way in form of direct action that people actually physically go and put themselves in a way to just leave the oceans alone, because dealing with people that actually are telling you right now, yeah, we're gonna cause destruction is actually giving them space for this to happen, especially when you have a limit of 2 years where they can just go ahead. So there's obviously a stupidity happening here. So we need to stand up and just do direct action in here. So yeah. What would it be?
Look, I think the power of direct action and being witness at such times is quite crucial. It's been very, very important role in terms of stopping nuclear testing, not just bottom trawling. Putting yourselves directly in the place where they're going to launch a nuclear weapon. So direct action is very critical, and particularly because it's in spaces that are so far out. So Greenpeace has been able to send its ship, and it was able to record an accident on one of these research vessels, losing its prototype. Again, these are conditions under which, so I think direct action has a role to play. It's highly expensive, particularly when you're talking about thousands of kilometers away in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. But in our communities, our people have been going out in canoes and putting up these traditional symbols of taboos to say stop, to bear witness and say stop. So direct action, of course, where you can, And if you have the means, certainly we need to bear witness at a time when it's very easy to just not see what's taking place. So there's a role for direct action and to bear witness.
I'm just going to quickly add on to that because it is hard for a lot of stakeholders and young people to participate in direct action. So things like social media can be used as a tool to put pressure on the right people to tell them we are watching from our homes. And that's also a great mechanism as well. So I'm going to go with who's the youngest out of these people? I saw y'all's hands. You're a woman, so I want you to do it. Your question. Oh, there's one on, should I take the online question? Okay.
Hello. Yeah, so thank you. That was a really great talk. And I guess I just wanted to know what the best outcome of this December meeting would be. What can we expect? Is there any pathway for a moratorium in the next, few months? How does that policy
For it
pathway
not
work?
to happen.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah,
my
for
answer.
exactly. I mean, the best outcome is for this meeting not to happen at all because it is unfair. Not all the governments will be able to participate, so that in itself should be reason to not hold it, because it'll just be the rich countries that get together again, because they'll have all the paperwork, and then they'll be deciding it. In December in Jamaica. Yeah, so that's the best outcome that we can hope for. And otherwise, if it does go ahead, then it'll be up to, some of the kind of disadvantaged countries to speak loudest. That's what we can hope for, that they speak loudest, like the African group of countries have been quite vocal about this being unacceptable to trigger this rule and, at a time like now and when we're nowhere near ready to even contemplate mining the deep sea. So if countries like that speak out vocally if they do meet in person and say, no, we're boycotting this process, we're not taking part in this, we cannot move ahead with this meeting. So that would be the second best outcome, that there's actual sort of, kind of revolution taking place from the inside. But all of that requires that they know that we're watching, that those governments know that the people that elected them are watching and don't find this acceptable practice.
So can we take this question from online?
Sure, thank you. So I have a question online from Luca in Italy, and he's asking, population growth will massively increase the demand of extracted mineral resources. Is it possible to support these demands without any major environmental damage?
I'm going to let them talk first.
I think it comes down to that question of proportionality that I talked about. I think this is a challenge that we would make this case that the industrialized world needs to start considering. Because I talked about this whole idea about acceptable damage. This is a really question that each and everyone needs to think about individually, to see what is it that you think is acceptable to maintain a lifestyle that is going to destroy your very future itself. So I think it's these kinds of questions for me are kind of simplistic in a way, because I think we need to push where moral responsibilities have got to sit. And we're pushing it to the global north and industrialized countries because you are at a level where your consumption it's got to take a curve, because we cannot continue to exploit to meet kind of maintaining a system to keep you comfortable, because it's not going to work. So I think this is a challenge that I want to make to everybody. Understand what is it that we are asking through deep sea mining, which is what level of risk or damage will be acceptable. We are really clear, under no circumstances is it acceptable or possible. The alternatives have already been talked about.
It also just shows, and it's very valid because a lot of people don't understand deep sea and deep sea science, and there's still much to do. But the deep sea is absolutely vital to our existence on this planet and to being able to reach our climate and ecological crises goals. So it's really a false narrative. I mean, do we need more rare earth minerals, or do we need a livable, functioning planet? And are we able to invest in different areas that we could still have this green renewable energy future and a future, but that's truly sustainable? It's to me, it's just simply a false choice. I do want to grab one more question. Mark.
Hey y'all, shout out to the South. I just wanted to say thank you so much, first of all, for this illuminating discussion. Especially as a youth, it's incredibly motivating to know that for one of the first times in human history, we have the ability to actually stop an unsustainable, destructive, exploitative practice from even beginning. But with COP26 in mind and future COPs in mind as well, and hopefully we will all be there as well, I was wondering, what are the types of formal outcomes and recommendations that we could potentially use at COP to advance a ban or moratorium on deep seabed mining, or if there are ways that we can use these conferences as a way to influence the ISA or further discussions on deep seabed mining?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not following the details of the COP negotiations, but what we would love to see is for deep sea mining to be part of the conversation, to be recognized as a climate solution. How are we going to mitigate the climate crisis? By protecting the deep sea. I mean, it's that simple. So an ideal outcome would be that governments recognize and talk in those terms. There's campaigns, you know, that are talking about how fish and just a healthy ocean. Oh, it's only a healthy ocean that's going to get us out of this climate crisis. But so far, we're really just talking in silos at this and other COPs. But what gives me hope is, I mentioned the IUCN, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they met in September, and there was overwhelming support for a moratorium on deep sea mining. So that, you know, that momentum, if that momentum can be picked up by this COP, that would be a great outcome. And we will keep pushing this message in the next, you know, well, we have a week left. Keep pushing this message and into the meeting if it happens in December. But yeah, it's really up to our governments to listen to us.
I think the real challenge with the COP is part of the way we relate to nature. It's so siloed, so that you've got a conference of parties looking at climate change, you've got oceans, which is governed separately, and then you've got a biodiversity crisis. Ideally, we need to be thinking systems thinking, which combines all of this. The fact that oceans is only reflected once in the UNFCCC, in Article 4, I think, is a problem, because if you look at it just purely from a climate context, right, all of the functions of the ocean in terms of regulating the climate is outside the accounting system of the UNFCCC. Absolutely. But this is the siloed ways that we are structuring our systems. And it's highly problematic. And then you've got biodiversity sitting somewhere else. And then the ISA sitting somewhere else. So I think for us in this COP, we need to secure a political decision on oceans as first step. Because if we don't, then the most critical part of climate functions and regulation still sits outside.
I took the liberty to go extra over. So thank you guys for showing up today, for showing up for our panel, for sticking around, for asking questions. I'm so sorry I didn't get to everyone, but please come talk to us after. And I just want to end, because that was the perfect ending, but just to reiterate the calls to action. Get out your phones, scan the QR code, sign the petition, follow us on social media, and wait for our announcement. And just like Maureen said, get involved in the movement, because this is really...
Make noise.
Make noise.
Make noise.
And tell your friends and family. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Please stick around. We've got the next session at 4, which will focus on gender equity and ocean conservation. So don't go far. Grab a coffee if you're here, if you're online. Thanks for joining us.